My daughter looked me in the eye at her husband's family dinner and said, "Mom, please don't share your opinions tonight." Then she turned away like I hadn't spent 31 years making sure she had opinions worth sharing. And 2 months later, when the architect's estate lawyer walked through the doors of the Harrington Group's grand opening gala, every person in that room finally understood exactly whose opinions had built the building they were standing in. My name is June Calloway. I'm 64 years old, and I never imagined I'd be the kind of woman who ends up in a story like this. I was a school teacher for most of my life. 3rd grade, then 4th, then back to 3rd, because the principal thought I was better with the younger ones. Maybe he was right. I had patience. Lord knows I had patience. My husband Walter Calloway was an architect. Not the flashy kind who puts his name on glass towers downtown. The quiet kind. The kind who draws until 2 in the morning. Because he wants the light in the hallway to fall just right. He used to say that a building should feel like it was always supposed to be there, like the land chose it. I used to tease him that he talked about buildings the way other men talked about their children. We had one child of our own. Our daughter, Renata. She was born in a blizzard in February. Walter drove 40 miles on icy roads to get me to the hospital, and he didn't complain once. He just held my hand in the waiting room and read the same 2 pages of an architecture magazine over and over, because he couldn't concentrate on anything else. When the nurse finally came out and told him he had a daughter, he cried. Big, quiet, embarrassing tears. And he didn't wipe them away. Renata was everything to us. She was sharp and funny and could argue her way out of anything by the time she was 7. I used to call her my little attorney. We never had much money. Walter's work paid the bills and occasionally a little more, but we lived modestly. A house in Knoxville, Tennessee. A used car that needed the passenger window cranked by hand. Vacations that meant driving to state parks and eating sandwiches on a blanket. But Renata never complained. Or if she did, she didn't mean it. Then Walter got sick. It started as something small. Fatigue. A cough that didn't leave. By the time the doctors found what was actually wrong, we had less time than any of us expected. Walter spent his last 8 months finishing a project he had started 3 years earlier. A mixed-use development in Chattanooga commissioned by a developer named Philip Arlen Stokes. Walter believed in the project completely. He talked about it, even when he was too tired to sit up straight. He said it was the best work he'd ever done. He never saw it finished. Walter died on a Thursday morning in April. Renata was 22. She held his hand at the end, and I stood on the other side of the bed and thought, we will get through this. We have to get through this. We had no other option. What followed were years I don't love to revisit. I taught school. I paid the mortgage. I made sure Renata finished college. She was studying business, which made Walter proud even from his hospital bed. She was going to do something with her life. That was never in doubt. What was in doubt sometimes was whether I was doing enough. Whether I was being enough. There were nights when I sat in the kitchen after Renata went to sleep, and I just stared at Walter's drafting table, which I couldn't bring myself to move. I kept a lamp burning on it. I don't know why. It just felt wrong to leave it dark. But life goes on. That's not a platitude, it's just true. Life doesn't wait for grief to finish its work. Renata graduated. She found a job with a commercial real estate firm in Nashville. She was good at it immediately, which surprised no one who knew her. She was 26 when she met her husband, son-in-law Cade Stokes. Yes, Stokes, as in Philip Arlen Stokes. Cade was Philip's son, his only son. When Renata first mentioned him, she described him as driven and confident, and someone who knows where he's going. Those were the words she used. I remember noticing that she didn't say kind, she didn't say thoughtful, she didn't say funny, but I told myself I was being uncharitable. I'd barely met the man. The first time I met Cade, he shook my hand correctly and said all the appropriate things. He was handsome. He wore his success like a second ease, effortless, natural, probably because he'd never had to work for the foundation of it. He told me how much he admired Renata and how serious he was about their future. I believed him, or I tried to. It was the first time I met Philip Arlen Stokes that something tightened in my chest and didn't let go. We had dinner at the Stokes family home outside Nashville. The house was large enough to feel lonely in, if that makes sense. Everything in it had been chosen to impress rather than to comfort. Philip was maybe 60, silver-haired, with the kind of controlled confidence that comes from decades of people agreeing with him. He kissed my hand when we met, which I found strange, and he called me June immediately, without asking whether that was what I preferred. When someone introduces themselves and immediately drops your last name, they're not being casual. They're establishing a hierarchy. I learned that in 30 years of dealing with parents who thought they knew better than the teacher. Dinner went smoothly on the surface. Good food, expensive wine, pleasant conversation about Renata and Cade's future. But underneath, I noticed things. The way Philip redirected every story back to himself. The way he described his company. The Harrington Group, which had been his late father-in-law's name, a detail that struck me as odd. As if he alone had conjured it from nothing. The way his eyes went briefly, almost imperceptibly flat whenever someone mentioned anything that didn't center him. And then, near the end of the meal, someone at the table brought up architecture. I don't remember how the subject came up. What I remember is what Philip said. He mentioned a development project in Chattanooga with a kind of breezy ownership. One of my best projects, he said. Took years, but I saw the vision through. I sat very still. I knew that project. I knew every line of it. I had watched my husband draw those lines until his hands shook from exhaustion. Walter had never named the project to me, in business terms, but I had seen enough documents over the years to know that the Arlen Place development in Chattanooga belonged to Philip Stokes's portfolio now. What I didn't know, sitting at that dinner table, was how it had gotten there, or whether the version of the story Philip told himself matched the version I suspected was true. I said nothing that evenings. I smiled and nodded and thanked Philip and his wife, Luann Stokes, for a lovely dinner. On the drive home, I stared out the window and tried to tell myself it meant nothing. People take credit, it happens. It wasn't worth disrupting my daughter's happiness over a dinner conversation, but it stayed with me. The engagement happened 6 months later. Renata called me, and I could hear the happiness in her voice. Real happiness, the kind that doesn't need to perform itself. I told her I was thrilled. I meant it. Whatever my feelings about Philip, Cade wasn't his father. Renata was smart enough to choose her own path. I told myself that for a long time. The changes were gradual. That's always how it happens, I think. Not one dramatic shift, but 100 small ones. So small you keep explaining them away. Renata started calling less. When she did call, the conversations felt edited somehow, like she was speaking through a screen. She talked about the Stokes family more and more. Philip's connections. Philip's opinion on Cade's career. Philip's plans for the company's expansion. His name appeared in every sentence the way weather appears in small talk. Constant, assumed, unavoidable. Then came the night of Philip's birthday dinner, and I heard what I was never meant to hear. It was a private family event at the Stokes estate. Maybe 20 people. I arrived on time, which apparently was the first mistake, because Philip preferred guests to arrive after him so he could make an entrance. I found myself standing near the kitchen hallway waiting for someone to tell me where to sit. That's when I heard Renata's voice from the next room. She was talking to Cade. The door wasn't fully closed. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, I was just standing there. She means well, Renata said. She just doesn't understand how things work at this level. A pause. Cade said something I couldn't hear clearly. Then Renata again. I know. I just need her to not embarrass us tonight. I didn't move for a long moment. Not embarrass us. Not embarrass us tonight. I thought about the 31 years. The sick days when I taught on 3 hours of sleep so I could save my personal days for Renata's school events. The summers I didn't take vacations so she could go on her class trip to Washington. The Tuesday nights I graded papers at the kitchen table while she did homework beside me. And she'd look up sometimes and say, "Mom, you work too hard," and I'd say, "So should you." Not embarrass us. I walked back to the living room. I found a chair near the window. I sat in it, and I smiled whenever anyone looked at me, and I waited for the evening to end. But something had shifted in me. Something quiet and permanent. The next morning, I opened Walter's filing cabinet. I had never gone through it entirely. After he died, I'd organized what I needed to and left the rest alone. Grief has a way of making certain doors feel dangerous. But that morning I opened every drawer and I went through every folder. It took 4 hours. What I found made my hands go cold. Walter had kept meticulous records, every project, every contract, every correspondence. In the third drawer, behind a folder labeled with the Chattanooga project's original name, was a document I'd never seen. A partnership agreement. Dated 18 months before Walter got his diagnosis, signed by Walter Calloway and Philip Arlen Stokes. I read it 3 times. Walter hadn't simply been hired to design the Arlen Place development. He had been a co-developer, not an employee, a partner. His contribution wasn't just the architectural plans. It was the original site concept, the zoning strategy, and according to the agreement, a deferred equity stake that would vest upon project completion. Walter died before the project was completed. I sat on the floor of the study for a long time. Then I thought about something else. Walter had a lawyer, a man named Arthur Gaines, who had done small estate work for us over the years. I hadn't spoken to Arthur Gaines in almost 9 years. But I remembered Walter mentioning him near the end, when he was very tired and the words came slowly. He said, "June, if anything ever comes up about the Chattanooga work, call Arthur." I'd thought at the time he meant something administrative, a final invoice, a handover of files. I didn't think he meant this. I called Arthur Gaines the next morning. He answered on the second ring, and when I said my name he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "June Calloway." I was beginning to wonder. I asked him what that meant. He said, "It means come in. There are some things we should have talked about a long time ago." Arthur Gaines's office was in a brick building downtown, 2nd floor, with a window that looked out onto a street where people walked dogs and carried coffee. The kind of office where serious things get said in quiet voices. He was in his late 70s now. White hair, careful eyes. He stood when I came in and shook my hand with both of his. We sat across from each other and he put a folder on the desk between us. "Walter left instructions," he said. I looked at the folder. What kind of instructions? The kind a man leaves when he doesn't trust someone to do right by his family after he's gone. My chest tightened. Philip Stokes. Arthur nodded slowly. Walter became concerned toward the end. The project was nearly done. Certain conversations had taken place that he found troubling. He asked me to hold these documents and to act on them only if you ever came to me, or if there was a clear reason to. "What's in there?" Arthur opened the folder. Inside were copies of the partnership agreement I'd already found, additional correspondence between Walter and Philip from the final months of the project, and something else. A letter. In Walter's handwriting, addressed to me. I recognized the paper. The pale blue stationery I'd given him for his birthday one year because he'd admired it in a shop window. He'd used it for important things. Arthur slid it across the desk. I didn't open it right away. I just held it. Finally, I asked, "Does the agreement still hold? Legally?" Arthur folded his hands. "That's a complicated answer. Give me the simple version." He looked at me carefully. Walter's equity stake was never formally dissolved. Philip allowed the project to complete, collected the returns, and proceeded as though the partnership agreement had expired with Walter's death. It did not. The room was very quiet. "How much are we talking about?" Arthur hesitated. Then he said the number. I had to ask him to repeat it. He did. I sat back in my chair. Outside, someone's dog was barking at a pigeon. The pigeon didn't seem troubled. Walter had built something. He had always been building something. And the man who had taken credit for it had spent years pretending my husband barely existed. I thought about Renata, about the way she talked about Philip, about the voice I'd heard through that not quite closed door. She didn't know. I was almost certain of it. Whatever Renata had become in that world, she hadn't become it knowingly. She trusted her father-in-law because he'd given her and Cade every advantage. She thought his success was his own. She had no reason to question it, but she was going to find out. I opened Walter's letter alone that night, at the kitchen table, with the lamp burning on his drafting table the way I'd kept it all these years. His handwriting was unsteady. He'd written it when he was very ill. Most of it was personal. Things between a husband and wife that belonged to no one else. But near the end, one paragraph stood out. He wrote, "I tried to believe Philip was a man of his word. I no longer believe that. I'm asking Arthur to hold what's necessary. I'm asking you, June, to trust your instincts. You always had better instincts than me. You just didn't always act on them. Act on them." I folded the letter. I sat there for a while. Then I called Arthur back and told him we were moving forward. What followed was several weeks of careful, quiet preparation. Arthur retrieved additional records. He brought in a colleague who specialized in partnership disputes. A woman named Sandra Whitley, who had the kind of calm precision that made you feel like the other side had already lost. Sandra examined every document. She spoke with 2 former employees of the Harrington Group, who had worked on the Chattanooga project and remembered Walter's involvement clearly. She built the case the way Walter built buildings, methodically, from the ground up, with nothing left to chance. During those weeks, Renata called twice. Both times I kept the conversation light. I asked about Cade. I asked about the house they were renovating. I asked about the project she was managing at work. I didn't mention Arthur. I didn't mention Sandra. I didn't mention the filing cabinet or the pale blue letter. I wasn't ready. And I needed her to hear the truth in the right place, at the right time, from the right source. That source turned out to be a grand opening. Philip had been planning the event for months. The Harrington Group's flagship Nashville development. 12 stories, mixed commercial and residential. The kind of project that puts a developer's name on the city's skyline for a generation. He called it the Stokes Tower, which I thought said everything you needed to know about the man. The grand opening was a major event. Press, investors, city council members, all of Philip's considerable social world gathered in one place to congratulate him on his vision, his leadership, his singular achievement. Arthur and Sandra arranged to be there. I arranged to be there too. Renata had invited me herself a few weeks before the event. "Mom, you should come," she said. "It's going to be a big night." I heard pride in her voice, pride in Cade, pride in the family she'd married into. It was real and it hurt, because I knew what was coming and she didn't. I wore the dark blue dress Walter always said made me look like I meant business. I drove myself. I arrived on time. The lobby of the Stokes Tower was everything Philip would have wanted it to be. High ceilings, dramatic lighting, important people in expensive clothes, holding champagne glasses and talking in the measured tones of people accustomed to being listened to. Renata found me near the entrance and hugged me, which surprised me. The hug lasted a second longer than her recent hugs had, as if part of her was remembering something. "You look great, Mom," she said. "So do you, honey." Philip was working the room with his usual efficiency. He spotted me, crossed over, and offered the same controlled smile he always did. "June, glad you made it." Then he moved on, because someone more important had arrived. Cade was attentive. Genuinely warm, actually. Whatever his flaws, Cade had never been deliberately unkind to me. He brought me a glass of sparkling water because he remembered I didn't drink. That small thing caught me off guard. I had to look away for a moment. The formal remarks began around 8. Philip took the podium with the ease of a man born to podiums. He thanked his team. He thanked his investors. He talked about vision and perseverance and the courage it takes to build something that will outlast you. The audience responded exactly as he intended. Then Arthur Gaines walked in through a side entrance. He had Sandra Whitley with him and a younger associate carrying a document case. They were quiet about it. They didn't make a scene entering. But I saw Philip notice them from the stage, and I saw his expression do something complicated for just a half second before he controlled it again. Arthur waited until Philip had finished his remarks and the applause had settled. Then he stepped forward. "Mr. Stokes," Arthur said, in the kind of voice that carries without being raised. "I apologize for the interruption. There are some matters that require the room's attention before this evening continues." The murmur that went through the crowd was immediate. Philip's smile returned, polished and dangerous. "Arthur Gaines. I didn't see your name on the guest list." "No," Arthur said. "I don't imagine you did." He introduced himself to the room. He explained, briefly and clearly, that he represented the estate interests of the late Walter Calloway. He explained that Walter Calloway had been a co-developer and equity partner in the Arlen Place project in Chattanooga, the project that had launched the Harrington Group's current expansion. He explained that the partnership agreement governing that relationship had never been legally dissolved. He explained that the equity owed to Walter Calloway's estate had never been paid. Then he said, "That equity belongs to Walter Calloway's wife. It belongs to June Calloway." I felt every eye in the room turn toward me. I did not look at Philip, I looked at Renata. Her face had gone still. Not angry, not upset, still. The way a person's face goes when they are trying very hard to process something that isn't processing. Cade's hand had found her arm. He was looking at his father. Philip recovered quickly. He always recovered quickly. This is a private legal matter, he said, addressing the room with the practiced calm of someone who expects to be believed. This is not the place. Sandra Whitley stepped forward. It became the place, she said pleasantly, when you chose to build your public legacy on a foundation you didn't construct alone. She began presenting documents, not dramatically, not with speeches. Just clearly, one after another, the way you lay out evidence when the evidence is enough on its own. The partnership agreement. The correspondence from the final months. A memo from Philip's own files, obtained through discovery, in which he had noted the partnership's value, and then written, in his own hand, a question about whether Walter's illness created any resolution opportunities. Resolution opportunities. When Sandra read that phrase aloud, I heard someone in the back of the room say something under their breath. I couldn't hear what, but the tone was unmistakable. Philip started to speak, then he stopped. Then he started again. Walter was a valued contributor. He was your partner, Arthur said. Simply, without heat. The room was very quiet. Then Renata spoke. She didn't shout, she didn't cry. She spoke in the same clear, measured voice she'd had since she was 7 years old arguing with her teachers. Dad. She was looking at Philip. Is what they're saying true? Philip looked at his son first, then at his daughter-in-law, then, finally, at the room. The calculation was visible, just for a moment, and that moment was more damaging than anything Arthur or Sandra had said. Things were more complicated than, Dad. Cade this time. His voice was different, hollowed out. Just answer her. Philip didn't answer, and a silence of that particular shape, in front of that many witnesses, is its own kind of answer. Renata turned and looked at me. Her eyes were full of something I recognized. It was the look she had as a little girl when she realized the world was capable of being unfair in ways she hadn't understood before. She'd looked at me that way the day Walter died. She was looking at me that way now. I crossed the room toward her. I didn't say anything. I just walked to where she was standing, and I put my hand on her face the way I had when she was small, and she leaned into it for a second before she caught herself. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered. I needed to be certain first, I said, and I needed you to hear it somewhere you couldn't be made to doubt it. She was quiet for a moment then. He used to talk about Dad's project, he called it his is. I know, all this time. I know. She pulled back, straightened. She had Walter's spine when she needed it. Okay, she said quietly, not to me, to herself. The way you say okay when you're deciding something. What followed in the next weeks and months was not simple or clean. Accountability rarely is. Philip contested. Philip delayed. Philip hired very expensive lawyers who were good at their jobs. Arthur and Sandra were better at theirs, and they had documents that didn't lie. The eventual settlement was private in its specifics and public in its consequences. Several investors withdrew from Philip's upcoming projects. A business publication ran a piece about the case that asked uncomfortable questions about how the Harrington Group had been built. Philip's name still appeared on the tower because the law couldn't remove it. But the story attached to that name had changed. Cade took it hard. Not the money, not the public part. The part where he understood that the foundation of everything his father had given him had been built partly on something that wasn't his father's to give. That's a particular kind of pain. I felt sorry for him. I still do. Renata and I had a long conversation the night after the settlement was finalized. We sat at my kitchen table, same one I'd sat at for 30 years, and she asked me things she'd been holding for months. Did you know? Before you went to Arthur? I suspected, I said. But suspecting and knowing are different. Why did he do it? She meant Philip. He didn't need the money. Not really. I thought about it for a while. Some people keep taking, I said, not because they need more, because they can't stand the idea that they needed someone else. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. I said something to Kate that night, the birthday dinner. About you, I know. She looked up. You heard? Yes. The word sorry sat between us for a long time before she said it. When she did, she didn't dress it up or explain it away. She just said it. Mom! I'm sorry. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. I know you are. I think I was trying so hard to belong there that I started looking at you through their eyes. And that's. She stopped. That's not something I'm proud of. No, I said. But it's something you recognized. That matters. We stayed at that table until late. We talked about Walter. She hadn't let herself talk about him much in the past few years, and I think some part of her had been storing up the need for it. She asked me to tell her things she didn't know, things from before she was old enough to remember. I told her about the blizzard, about the architecture magazine in the waiting room, about the way he cried when they told him he had a daughter. She didn't know that part, about the crying. When I told her, she pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment. He would have handled all of this better than me, she finally said. He would have been frightened and uncertain, and he would have done what was right anyway, I said. Same as you. I used Walter's portion of the settlement to establish something I'd been thinking about since the first morning in Arthur's office. A fund for architectural preservation, specifically supporting the documentation and attribution of designers whose contributions to major projects had been lost, overlooked, or deliberately obscured. I named it the Calloway Documentation Fund. Not after myself, after the family name. After both of us. Arthur said Walter would have found the whole thing ironic and satisfying in equal measure. I think that's right. Sandra Whitley came to the small ceremony when the fund was officially established. She brought a bottle of very good champagne and said she'd had better cases, but never a better client. I told her I wasn't sure that was true, but I appreciated it. Renata and Cade were there. Their marriage had gone through its difficult months, while Cade worked through what he'd learned about his father. Some nights were very hard for them, but they were the kind of people who argued instead of going quiet, which I'd always believed was a sign of a real marriage. They were still arguing. Still together. Still working on it. Philip Stokes was not there. I didn't expect him to be. I have thought about Philip a great deal since everything happened. Not with anger, or not only with anger. Mostly with a kind of tired bewilderment. He had enough. He had always had enough. But he had spent nearly 20 years telling a story about himself that required my husband to be invisible in it, and he had told it so often and so smoothly that I think by the end he had half convinced himself it was true. That's the thing about letting someone else's story replace the real one. Eventually the two get confused, even in the mind of the person doing the replacing. Walter was not invisible. He was a man who designed buildings that felt like they were always supposed to be there. And the most important thing he ever designed was the life we built together. No partnership agreement can measure that. No settlement amount can reflect it. But the record is corrected now. His name is on the fund. His name is in the legal files. His name is attached to the Arlen Place project in the way it always should have been. The drafting table is still in the study. I still keep a lamp burning on it. I know that might seem like a strange habit for a woman who is otherwise perfectly practical. But some lights you just keep on, not because you need them to see, but because they remind you what was worth seeing in the first place. If you've ever stayed silent when you knew you should speak, or if someone you loved has been overlooked or diminished by people who should have known better, I hope this story found you at the right time. You are not invisible, and the truth, as Walter used to say, may take a while to arrive, but it always finds the right address.